the other element we've got in terms of industrial load in Alberta is that the thermal requirement, the steam requirement, is pretty significant, particularly when you get into the Fort McMurray area and you get into bitumen extraction through what are called SAGD projects, steam-assisted generation projects. So the net effect is that they'll make decisions in terms of that electricity that are going to be impacted by the transmission build, but in this case, it'll be decisions to look at on-site generation, and they've got a use for the steam that can come out of the cogeneration activity, and so they're not going to be picking up the anticipated share of the transmission build that's being planned, and then the cost consequence falls back to everyone else. And it's not that industrial customers are want to ignore that. I mean, a lot of they still will be connected to the transmission system, so those costs are going to go up. But everybody else's costs are going to go up as a result, and it's a consequence of a transmission build of the magnitude that's being contemplated, which is way beyond what exists in terms of any kind of an immediate requirement. And the net effect is that we're going to turn what's supposed to be a support to industrial development into an argument for not doing what's intended, which is to use the transmission system to access energy. They'll do their own development, and that's a portion of them, and that doesn't get taken into consideration in terms of the planning that's going on. I mean, we just got an uncontrolled planning process that's not looking at what are the alternatives, what are the benefits of alternatives, and how do you implement some of those in a more cost-efficient manner than what we've got.
I'm curious, Sheldon, what's your organization's latest calculation as to how industrial power rates might increase as a result of the construction of the Bill 50 lines?
Well, on the transmission side, a lot of our members are directly connected, but others are also connected through distribution. But in either case, it still flows through in the same manner, whether you pay it through ATCO and Fortis connections or whether you pay directly to the transmission provider. The cost consequences are significant. We're looking at roughly $10 a megawatt hour in 2009, based on applications in front of the Commission right now from ATCO and AltaLink, assuming they're approved. By 2013, we're looking at that number going to about $22. By 2017 or 2018, when we're further down the road in terms of the full magnitude of the build, we're in excess of $30 a megawatt hour, or a tripling of the cost of having transmission-connected projects. And that becomes a significant variable in terms of what are your energy costs and what do you do relative to those energy costs. So you've got kind of two choices. You can avoid it by building on-site generation, or you can look at other jurisdictions and say, do I want to have my processing activity being done out of province? And a lot of our members they're big North American-wide corporations, and they'll make a decision to source product from the lowest cost jurisdiction. They don't necessarily say, well, I'm here in Alberta, I'll produce here in Alberta. And so it'll have a fundamental effect in terms of what happens from an industrial perspective for the next 10, 15 years.
One of the things that I'm understanding is the potential implications is that this building transmission lines that are actually not needed and driving up the cost of electricity as a result, or at least the transmission component, will discourage new industry from establishing in Alberta, and in fact could force existing industry that uses a lot of electricity to move activities outside of Alberta. I think I've heard the expression that because of Bill 50, if you can put it through a pipeline, put it on a truck or a rail car, the processing activities will leave the province. What's your reaction to that?
That's correct. If you're going to look at processing in Alberta, or let's take bitumen upgrading. So if you're going to look at bitumen upgrading in Alberta, you need to have a cost-benefit differential to where the alternative is. The alternative is to put the bitumen into pipelines, add the diluent and ship it to another jurisdiction that will do the upgrading and the refining and where it goes from there. And there's a number of those, certainly to the south, that are already in a position to be able to do upgrading and refining, and they have a lower cost jurisdiction relative to the costs of that process. So yes, we will be shipping more of the base product out and moving the consequences of that economic activity to a different jurisdiction. That's in the oil and gas, or in the oil side of the activity, even to an extent a little bit on the gas side. I mean some of the upgrading activity for extracting liquids and those things are electricity intensive. So do you ship more of the gas out with the liquids in it, or do you process them here? Well, the decision becomes an economic decision, and our cost structure related to electricity intensive activities is going to change those dynamics with respect to what occurs. And it defeats to an extent what the provincial energy strategy is, which is to encourage more value-add activity within the province. And that's what's peculiar about the consequence of what's going on the transmission side.
Some of the people that I've spoken with in the cattle industry, for example, are very concerned about the effect it'll have on them, because electricity is a major operating cost in modern packing plants.
Sure, meat processing is, it's electricity intensive, and you'll add cost to that processing aspect. And we're already short competition in the cattle processing, or the kill side. What it does is it encourages more export of the animal for finishing in the kill cycle in some other jurisdiction.
Sheldon, when people who are unfamiliar with the implications of Bill 50 sit down at a meeting and listen to you explain what the implications are actually going to be, including the negative impact on investment and jobs, what is it that they are saying? How are they responding?
There is a general disposition to wonder what's going on. I mean, that's why they came, is they know there's something that's at issue. But most of them are looking at it from what's the most immediate impact, which is, is it going to be sited on my land, and what are the consequences? What I try to do when I go through the presentation is explain the nature of how we got to where we've got to, and focus on what are the costs, and always avoiding the issue of we don't need any transmission. We do need some regional transmission in this province. There's a number of projects that are quite important, but they're lost. They're obscured by the sheer magnitude of what's called the system component, and those are really the subject of the Bill 50 lines. And when you start to look at what are those costs, but also the uncontrolled nature of those costs increasing, and an inability to have a check and balance with respect to that, there's a general dismay that this is going to have a consequence that's not just another power line on my land, but it's another cost that I need to take into consideration that's going to affect me, not just in my monthly bill, but it's going to affect me in terms of general economic activity.
I understand that there's an important difference between Bill 50 lines and non-Bill 50 lines. If you were asked by a landowner to briefly explain that difference, Keith or Sheldon, how would you reply to that question?
Well, a Bill 50 line is a line that's been designated by the government as being needed without having to go through a needs assessment. I mean, that's the technical definition of them. And so far, they've identified 5 lines as being Bill 50 lines.
Let me just add a little bit, if I can, to that, Keith. The other characteristic of these lines is that they're part of what's called the bulk system, which is the theoretical backbone of the infrastructure, and it doesn't include regional lines. So regional lines are the lines that are coming off of substations and are supplying directly to new residential areas that are being built or new industrial processes. And within the total cost structure right now, the regional lines that are out there that are basically approved or have been approved through the traditional process in front of the Commission are about $4.5 billion. The total bill that's in front of us at this point is in excess of $15 billion. And I guess there's a third category that's somewhere in between those two, which are transmission lines that are being built specifically for renewable energy projects. We've got about close to $3 billion worth of lines, primarily in southern Alberta, that are being put in place to support primarily wind-related projects. And so there's kind of three different classes of lines that are in the process. What we're doing is trying to do all three of them at the same time and having those cost implications flow through to today's ratepayer. And I literally mean today's ratepayer, because we've got another request in front of the Commission that those lines that are being directed, particularly the Bill 50 lines, can go into rate base as they're being built. So we're looking at rate increases coming from AltaLink and ATCO for lines that in fact won't be completed till about 2014. Now that's a new feature in Alberta. We've never had a situation where you're paying for the line before it's actually used and useful, or before it's actually completed. So we have this compounding cost factor that's coming in as we try to incorporate all of these lines.
Sheldon, Keith Wilson here. Several weeks ago, I was invited by Minister Mel Knight to meet with him to discuss Bill 36. But of course, during the course of the meeting, I couldn't resist the temptation, given that he was Minister of Energy when Bill 50 was brought in, to turn the discussion to power lines. And I was quite struck by some of his comments to me when I was challenging him and the government's decision to move forward with the Bill 50 lines. In particular, the justification that he advanced, and primarily the sole justification, was that the purpose of the Bill 50 lines, so these are the north-south, HVDC lines on either side of the province, and the Heartland line and so on, is to allow us to import low-cost electricity from Manitoba. And hydropower from Manitoba. I'd be interested in what your comments are on that from your expertise.
There's, quote, always been this dream of a trans-Canadian east-west major hydro-based infrastructure, so you can literally access northern hydro projects and move the power east-west rather than north-south. Most of the interconnects that we have in electricity in Canada are north to south. Ontario connects with the U.S. below, but not with Quebec and not with Manitoba in terms of the different jurisdictions. So we've always had this kind of dream of being able to run an east-west, high-capacity transmission system, but the economics don't bear out.
You have been listening to part one of a two-part discussion about Alberta's Bill 50 and the impact the legislation is going to have on all Albertans. Part 2 will air next week. CAEPLA Connections Landowner Talk Radio is sponsored by CAEPLA, the Canadian Association of Energy and Pipeline Landowner Associations. CAEPLA is a non-profit association that is not underwritten or sponsored by any foundation or institution, nor do we accept grants from the government. As a non-profit organization, we rely upon the voluntary support of people like you who think this kind of thoughtful and informative approach to landowner issues is valuable. So if you think this kind of programming is worthwhile, we invite you to go to landownerassociation.ca on the internet, click the icon on the navigation bar that lets you take out an associate membership, and then just simply follow that through. We'll end the program this week by asking you to consider the fact that private property creates an arena in which individuals are free from the power of the state. Apart from laws that impose limits on what governments and politicians can do with and to other people's property, the fact is that freedom, as most people understand it, doesn't exist. That's it for CAEPLA Connections Landowner Talk Radio. We'll see you next week at the same time.